So instead of looking at the entire A minor or C major pentatonic scale, it's the same 5 notes regardless of whether it's the A minor or C major pentatonic scale. Instead of looking at the entire thing, we're going to just kind of focus on this position right here, pentatonic position number 1. I'm sure you've seen this before. So also we're going to add the lower extension and the upper extension to pentatonic position number 1. So right there, that gives you like this diagonal area to play in. So instead of being confined to just like this little box area right here, or this box area right here, or this box area, instead of confining yourself to individual box areas, you can kind of do things like, so you have like this large area that you can play in, and you're not really playing the entire box shapes for each of these 3 positions. You're just playing a little bit of this box area, this full box area, and then a little bit of this box area. You also have the exact same thing up here. So here's that same box pattern number 1 right here. Here's your lower extension. Here's your upper extension. So we're just going to fill in the rest of the fretboard, and we're just going to add one additional box pattern, and that is going to be pentatonic position number 4. You can always find pentatonic position number 4. Remember, we're in the key of A minor or the key of C major here. So minor, major, minor, major. Just like you locate your pentatonic position number 1, A minor, C major, A minor, C major. You locate pentatonic position number 4 the exact same way, but you find your minor, major scale roots on the A string. So A minor, C major, A minor pentatonic scale, C major pentatonic scale. You're still using the entire fretboard, but you're just not using 5 full box patterns anymore. Now you're just focusing on 2 full box patterns, and then one of those 2 box patterns has a lower and an upper extension to it. It's a lot less to remember, and just from my experience, it's a lot easier to navigate the fretboard in this kind of reduced pentatonic visualization. All right, so that is the first thing. Let's now get on to the 3 tips. So tip number 1, always maintain an awareness of where your major and your minor scale roots are, no matter which position you happen to find yourself in. Even if you're utilizing the full box pattern and you're not doing the cut the fat thing that we talked about, always be aware of where the minor scale root and the major scale root is. On these fretboard diagrams that I'm using, the minor scale root is always indicated with a white dot and the major scale root is always indicated with a red dot. We're in the key of A minor. You could also call this the key of C major. The backing track that I'm using contains both an A minor chord and a C major chord, so it's not really clear, is this an A minor chord progression or is this a C major chord progression? It's not really clear. So A would be your minor scale root, C would be your major scale root. So always maintain an awareness of where those are. So maintaining this awareness of where the major and minor scale root are is going to help you to keep your connection with the underlying chords and the chord progression. That's a big thing that a lot of people have trouble with. They kind of think only of the key and they kind of ignore the underlying chords. So paying attention to the major and minor scale root is really going to help you to maintain that connection with the underlying chords. So the rhythm section that we're using here for these demos contains the 4 most commonly used chords in any key. It's the 1 chord, the 4 chord, the 5 chord, and the 6 chord. So in this key, C would be your 1 chord, F would be your 4 chord, G would be your 5 chord, and then A minor would be your 6 chord. So anytime the 6th chord of the key occurs, which in this case is the A minor chord, the major and the minor scale root are both going to sound good because they're both chord tones. So over the A minor chord, which contains the notes A, C, and E, the A is a chord tone of that chord, and the C is a chord tone of that chord. Both the major and the minor scale root are going to sound good over the 6th chord, and of course that applies to any key. And then over the C major chord, which is the 1 chord of this key, the major scale root is obviously going to sound good. In this case, the major scale root is the note C. The note C is going to sound good over a C major chord, obviously. But you may want to avoid the minor scale root in that case. So as guitar players, we tend to kind of favor minor keys over major keys. I mean, I'm not going to say that applies to all guitar players, but a lot of guitar players, they seem to favor minor keys, which means that when we're doing these pentatonic licks, we tend to do things that end our phrases like... So we kind of end our phrases on the minor scale root. But the minor scale root is not a chord tone of the one chord. So if you find yourself playing in a major key context, like you're playing in the key of C major, there's no A minor chord present, and you're finding that your pentatonic licks just aren't sounding good when you're landing on that note, you're like, why is this not working? It's because that's not a chord tone of the C major chord. So you might want to alter your phrasing such that your licks kind of end like... So you want to end on the major scale root, and that's going to connect perfectly with that C major chord, right? Now, on the F chord, which is the 4 chord of the key, both the major and the minor scale root are going to sound great. The chord tones of the F major chord are F, A, and C. A's in there, C's in there. So anytime you have a 4 chord, major, minor scale root sounds great. And then when the 5 chord comes along, which in this case is the G major chord, neither the major or the minor scale root are going to be chord tones. The G major chord contains the notes G, B, and D, so there's no A in there, there's no C in there. I'm not saying you can't play an A or a C over a G major chord. You absolutely can. I'm just saying it's not a chord tone of the 5 chord. So just keeping this stuff in mind right here, just keeping major and minor scale root in mind, and what to do over the 1 chord, what to do over the 6 chord, what to do over the 4 chord, what to do over the 5 chord, right there you're thinking in terms of the underlying chords as opposed to just thinking in terms of the key. Additionally, by knowing where the major and minor scale root is, you can find other notes that are part of the key that are also going to work in many situations. So, for example, the major scale root, if you go 1 whole step above the major scale root, that's always going to be a note that you can bend, and you can bend it by a full step. So you've probably seen, pentatonic licks. You see people bending that note all the time. That's the note that's 1 whole step higher than the major scale root. So it doesn't matter where your major scale root is. So wherever that major scale root is, 1 whole step higher, you bend that by a whole step. And now you can take the minor scale root and you can bend that by 1.5 steps. By bending the minor scale root by 1.5 steps, you are achieving the same pitch as the major scale root. So here's your minor scale root right here. 1, 2, 3. There's your major scale root. It's the same as this note. So if you take the minor scale root and you bend it by 1.5 steps, you're going to be achieving the pitch of the major scale root. So you're probably not going to bend this note right here by 1.5 steps. You're not always going to bend the minor scale root by 1.5 steps, but here's a great spot to do it. Right here in this little upper extension, you have your minor scale root right here on the B string, 10th fret. So that's just some things to think about just regarding this major and minor scale root. So that's the first tip. So the second tip is to add the blue note. So the blue note is actually an out-of-key note, but it's one of the most commonly used outside notes, especially in rock and classic rock and stuff like that. So you can go and you can find out exactly where that blue note fits into each of your 5 pentatonic positions. In each of the 5 positions, there's going to be the blue note in 2 spots. But kind of sticking to this whole, reducing things and cutting the fat and just kind of this simplified version of the pentatonic scale that we're working on in this lesson, a very, very easy way to locate the blue note is that it is always 1/2 step higher than the note that is a whole step higher than the major scale root. I know that sounded kind of confusing, but we were just looking at that note before. So you have your major scale root right here, and then 1 whole step higher is that note that you bend. So if you don't bend that by a whole step and you just kind of just go up a 1/2 step, that's where the blue note is. major scale root as a reference point, it's relatively easy to find where this blue note is. It's just 1.5 steps higher than the major scale root. All right, so again, this stresses the importance of knowing where the major and minor scale roots are at all times, regardless of which position you are playing in. So the third tip is to add one additional note that is outside of the pentatonic scale, and this note is going to be found 1/2 step below the major scale root. So adding this note is still an in-key note, because remember, the pentatonic scale is 5 of the 7 total notes of the diatonic scale. Regardless of what key you're playing in, there's the 7-note diatonic scale, that's the full key scale. The pentatonic scale is just 5 of those 7 total notes. So this note that we're adding right here is one additional note of the total 7-note scale. So we're still in key here. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about this note. They'll say if you want to make your pentatonic playing sound more melodic, just add this note in there, and that's absolutely correct. But the thing is, I would rather do so with purpose. So if you're going to add this extra note in there, by all means add it as much as you want over any chord you want, letting your ear be the guide. But me personally, if I want to add this one additional note in, I'm going to do it with purpose. And I'm going to do it every single time the 5 chord occurs. So every time the 5 chord occurs, which in this case is the G major chord, it's a chord tone. The G major chord is the notes G, B, and D. This note that we're adding is the note B. So that's a chord tone of the G major chord. So you could hear in that demo, every time we included that one additional note that was outside of the pentatonic scale by 1/2 step, 1/2 step below the major scale root, every time you added that note, it made a very strong connection with that 5 chord, which in this case is the G major chord. So one last quick tip about this additional note that we've just added, and that is that this note will be a chord tone of the chords that are on the clockwise side of the grouping of 6 on the circle of fifths. So if you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I use the circle of fifths in almost every single video. You know that the circle of fifths will give you your 6 diatonic major and minor chords for any given key. So within the grouping of 6, the chords that are in the clockwise side, both of those chords are going to be where that note fits, because it's a chord tone of both of those chords. So in this key that we're in right now, the key of C major, the key of A minor, the clockwise chords, G major, we already talked about that, G, B, D, so that note B is going to sound great over G major chord. Then you have your other chord, E minor, E, G, B. Again, there's a B in that chord, so that note is going to sound great over that. Many times you're going to find that the chord that's in the circle of fifths, inner circle clockwise position, is made into a major chord. So a lot of times within the key of, especially when you're viewing a key from the minor perspective, a lot of times that E minor is going to be made into an E major chord. No problem. E, G sharp, B. That B is still there too. So as you're doing all your pentatonic noodling, blah, 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 G major comes along, boom, you jump out of the pentatonic scale, you hit that note. Anytime you're noodling around in your pentatonic scale, E minor chord comes along, boom, you hit that note. It's going to sound great. Or if that E minor chord is made into a major chord, same thing, boom, you hit that note, it's going to sound great. So that's that. So those are my 3 tips. So hopefully this can help you to break out of your pentatonic rut. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask. See you next time.